This is the story of the rise of an idea that has come to dominate our society. It is the belief that the satisfaction of individual feelings and desires is our highest priority.
Today we're going to tell you how to get whatever you want.
I wanted to live a different life that wasn't available to me in the image I was born.
I'm here, look at me, notice me.
Previous episodes have shown how this rise of the self was fostered and promoted by business. They had used the ideas of Sigmund Freud to develop techniques to read the inner desires of individuals and then fulfill them with products. This final episode is about how that idea took over politics. It tells the story of how politicians on the left, in both America and Britain, turned to these techniques to regain power. They believed that they were creating a new and better form of democracy, one that truly responded to the inner feelings of individuals. But what the politicians didn't realise was that the aim of those who had originally created these techniques had not been to liberate the people, but to develop a new way of controlling them in an age of mass democracy. The roots of the story lie way back in the America of the 1920s with one man. He was called Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Bernays had been one of the inventors of the profession of public relations, and he was fascinated by his uncle's theory that human behaviour was driven by unconscious sexual and aggressive drives. Many of Bernays' clients were large American corporations, and he was the first person to show them how they could sell many more products if they linked them through images and symbols to those unconscious desires that Freud had identified. A vast industry had grown up in America devoted to reading the inner desires of consumers. At its heart was the technique of the focus group. Previous episodes have shown how the focus group was invented by psychoanalysts employed by US corporations. The aim was to allow consumers to express their inner feelings and needs, just as patients did in psychoanalysis. The information was then used to promote and design new products that would fulfill those desires. And Edward Bernays, who was now nearly 100 years old, was celebrated as the founding father of this marketing world. In this new climate, the focus group flourished, and those who ran them borrowed from the techniques of psychotherapy to delve ever deeper into people's feelings about products.
We're trying to understand how people feel about brands, how they relate to brands, that is to say, what the brand's personality is as far as consumers are concerned. And there are a number of techniques which are very, very helpful for getting to that understanding.
To Thatcher and Reagan, this was a new and better form of democracy. But to their opponents in the parties of the left, they had summoned up the most selfish and greedy aspects of human nature.
Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher both embraced an economic philosophy that says the unit of judgment was not only the individual, but it was the individual's personal satisfaction, the individual's own unique happiness and well-being. It was, in a sense, the triumph of regarding individuals as purely emotional beings who have needs and wants and desires that need to be satisfied and can be satisfied unconsciously. It goes way back to the early part of the 20th century, to Freud, to notions of the unconscious, the assumptions that we are, in terms of our rational minds, we're little corks bobbing around on this great sea of hopes and fears and desires of which we are only dimly aware. And that the role of a marketer, the role of somebody selling something, including a politician, is to appeal to this great swamp of desire, of unconscious desire.
Gould believed that Labour's leadership had become corrupted by the same patrician arrogance that dominated all Britain's institutions. They denigrated and disapproved of the new aspirations of working-class voters.
Labour stopped listening to these people. And I remember the best example of this was after the election of 1983, which was the election, above all, where the people's voices just were not heard. And I had dinner with a leading Labour Party figure who'd been involved in the defeat, heavily involved in the defeat, and his wife said, God, these working class people, they just, you know, we give them education, we give them chances in life, what do? They read the Sun and they just don't vote for us. And there was such a gap between these people just trying to make lives for themselves, better lives for themselves, and the kind of elitism of the Labour Party that was just such a chasm that had to be filled.
Gould became part of a small group of modernisers centred around Peter Mandelson. Their aim was to reconnect Labour with the lost voters. To do this, Gould turned to the technique he knew well from his work in advertising, the focus group. Gould commissioned focus groups in suburban areas across the country with small groups of voters who had switched to Mrs. Thatcher. People were encouraged not to talk rationally about policies, but to express their underlying feelings. And what Gould discovered was a fundamental shift in people's relationship to politics. They no longer saw themselves as part of any group, but as individuals who could demand things from politicians in return for paying taxes, just as business had taught them to do as consumers.
And I found that the people had become consumers. People now wanted to have, you know, politics and life on their own terms. I mean, not just in politics, but in all aspects of life too. People see themselves as they are, as autonomous, powerful individuals who are entitled to be respected, who are entitled to have the best, not just in, going to Tesco's or wherever, but the best in terms of health and in education too. All this was about getting the Labour Party to understand that people really, really, really had changed, and the Labour Party had not, and unless the Labour Party changed, it would not win.
Philip Gould now set out to try and persuade the Labour Party that they would have to make concessions to what he called the new aspirational classes. But he was going to face implacable opposition. In the run-up to the 1992 election, Gould argued that the only way to win was for Labour to promise not to put up taxes. But the Shadow Chancellor, John Smith, angrily refused. Labour would stick to its fundamental policies. They would fight the election with the promise of tax increases to create a fairer society. And as the campaign began, it seemed as if Philip Gould was wrong. The traditional polls consistently showed Labour ahead, despite the Conservative campaign message that a Labour government would put up taxes. Even the Conservatives' oldest allies in the press became convinced that by harping on about tax, the Conservatives were cutting their own throats.
So the worry about the Tories must be that they're not at the moment conveying a sense of grip and being in control. And unless they can do better than that, I think they're going to lose.
The other thing is that they still say that they are going to go on and on with this one single message of tax. And I think, part of the difficulty this morning was that you had a whole lot of people who've been going to the same press conference for 7 days, had virtually the same message thrust at them, and are kind of getting bored and restless and hitting back on it.
I think the media sense a big story coming in the Tories being defeated.
And the Labour Party too was convinced it would win and finally return to power.
It's now time to meet the men and women who will form the next government. Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Smith. And now, it is time for the next Prime Minister, Neil Kinnock.
Those running Labour's campaign believed that by modern presentation they would attract back the voters, yet keep the old policies. But Philip Gould was convinced that Labour were going to lose. Through his focus groups, he knew that the very people who were telling the traditional pollsters they would vote Labour were in reality preparing to vote Conservative out of self-interest. But they were too embarrassed to admit it. And John Major also knew this, because his focus groups were telling him the same thing.
do you make of the poll, which puts Labour 5 points ahead?
Sir, just one to the Daily Mail, sir.
Feel out in the streets that matters.
It's feeling good on the streets, is it?
It is feeling good on the streets, yes. It has been feeling surprisingly good on the streets for some time. Quite surprisingly, quite out of line with opinion polls. Don't ask me to explain it, but the feel's all right.
Sir?
Anyway, go on. No, lads, you must sit down. We're waiting to go.
John Major's victory in 1992 was a disaster for the Labour Party. The small group of reformers centred around Peter Mandelson and Philip Gould were convinced that the only way for the party to survive was to change its basic policies. But their ideas were rejected by John Smith, who had now become leader. Philip Gould left Britain to go to work for the campaign to elect Bill Clinton president in America.
The 1992 election, during it and afterwards, people felt under great strain and really did feel demoralised and dejected. And then to go from this to the Clinton campaign, it was an extraordinary experience, because here suddenly I found articulated many of the ideas that I'd had but not fully myself been able to encapsulate or to articulate.
If you want a president who will restore the middle class, reclaim the future for the middle class, and restore the American dream, vote for Bill Clinton in New Hampshire and send a signal to the country that we are coming together.
What Gould discovered was that, like the Labour Party, the Democrats had also been doing focus groups with swing voters. The difference was that Bill Clinton had decided to tailor his policies to fit with these voters' desires. Above all, with their ferocious belief that they should only pay tax for things that benefited them, not for the welfare of others.
I have no idea what percentage of my tax dollars go to welfare, but even if it's a minuscule percentage, even if it's a quarter of a percent, it's still too much for the people that are receiving these benefits that are basically non-productive.
The Clinton team decided that to win they had to promise tax cuts for these suburban voters. And they also used the focus groups throughout the campaign to check every appearance, speech and policy with them for their approval. What Clinton called the forgotten middle class became central figures in a new type of reactive politics.
Candidates for the presidency of the United States had been prepackaged and designed for many, many years. What was new was an attempt to use very sophisticated or pseudo-sophisticated techniques to plumb the public psychology, to find out precisely what the desires of the individuals were, and then to come up with a candidate and a platform and images and words that exactly responded to those deep desires. This was packaging at a new level. This was polling at an extreme.
I'm not going to raise taxes on the middle class. And the middle class needs a break. Government is in the way. It's taking more of your money and giving you less in return. In the name of the hard-working Americans who make up our forgotten middle class, I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States.
Stay focused. Talk about things that matter to people. It's the economy, stupid.
What Morris told Clinton was that to win re-election, he would have to transform the very nature of politics. The crucial swing voters in the suburbs now thought and behaved like consumers. The only way to win them back was to forget all ideology and instead turn politics into a form of consumer business. Clinton must try to identify their personal desires and whims and then promise to fulfill them. If he followed those consumer rules, they would follow him.
I said that I felt the most important thing for him to do was to bring to the political system the same consumer rules philosophy that the business community has. Because I think politics needs to be as responsive to the whims and the desires of the marketplace as business is. And it needs to be as sensitive to the bottom line, profits or votes, as a business is. I think that all of this involves really a changed view of the voters, so that instead of treating them as targets, you treat them as owners. Instead of treating them as something that you can manipulate, you treat them as something you need to learn from. And instead of feeling that you can stay in one place and you can manipulate the voters, you need to learn what they want and move yourself to accommodate it.
To get inside the minds of the swing voters, Morris brought lifestyle marketing into politics for the first time. He went to one of America's most prominent market research firms called Penn & Schern and commissioned what they called a neuro-personality poll. It was a massive survey of hundreds of thousands of voters, but the only political questions it asked were to find out whether someone was a swing voter or not. All the other questions were intimate psychological ones, designed to see whether swing voters fell into identifiable psychological types.
Well, we were asking people like, do you think you're the life of the party? Do you think when you see things that you like to have a list and organize them? Do you typically try to plan things ahead, or do you like to be more spontaneous? Where do you like to go? What sports do you like to play? What would you do with your spouse on a romantic weekend? So we were asking people some very personal questions about their own lives to try to see were the kinds of people that were likely to change their vote also possessing of certain kinds of personality traits. And in fact they were.
The neuro-personality poll allowed the Clinton team to segment swing voters into different lifestyle types. They were given names like pools and patios, or caps and gowns, who were urban intellectuals living in university towns. From this, the team could identify ways in which they could make individuals feel more secure in their chosen lifestyles, just as business had learnt to do with products. Dick Morris called it small-bore politics, tiny details of people's lives and personal anxieties which politics had never even thought about or noticed before, but which now had become the key to winning power.
It was an America that focused on day-to-day practical concerns. Should I wear seatbelts? Should I stop smoking? Should I wear a school uniform? Is my neighborhood being protected? It was not so much a new individualism as the social order as we had known it had broken down. So we got into people's heads, understood their psychology about lifestyle, about values, what they thought was important, what issues they wanted politicians, and particularly the president, to address. And these issues proved to be very, very different from what the conventional wisdom had suggested.
As the election campaign began, Clinton revealed Morris's new approach to a shocked White House. All traditional policies were to be dropped. Instead, he would concentrate exclusively on policies that targeted the worries of the swing voters. V-chips would be fitted into televisions to prevent children from watching pornography. And mobile phones would be fitted into school buses to make parents feel more secure. Dick Morris also persuaded the president to spend his leisure time in the same way as particular groups of swing voters. He sent Clinton on a hunting holiday, dressed in exactly the Gore-Tex outfits a group called Big Sky Families liked. The aim was to reflect swing voters' lifestyles back to them. The Liberals in Clinton's cabinet hated this approach.
And I would say, well, Dick, why have a campaign? This was the 1996 campaign. If all the president is going to do is offer up these little bite-sized miniature initiatives that appeal to people's desires, like consumers, buying soap, V-chips that you could put in your televisions so you could make sure that your children did not have pornography, and school uniforms. Why talk about them? They're so mundane and they're so tiny. And he would say back, if we don't do this, we may not get reelected. And I would say, what's the point of getting reelected if you have no mandate to do anything when you're reelected? And he'd say, what's the point of having a mandate if you can't get reelected? Isn't the ultimate goal getting reelected?
But Morris's new politics were an extraordinary success. Clinton's ratings among the swing voters began to soar. And Dick Morris, along with the marketeer Mark Penn, took effective charge of making White House policy. Mark Penn set up a huge call centre in an office block in Denver. And every night, hundreds of telephone operators called swing voters in suburbs across the country to check with them every detail of policies that Clinton was proposing.
The policy was made by a group of people manning telephones in Denver, Colorado, placing calls to voters in places like Westchester and Pasadena, and asking them what they wanted from their government, and asking them very specifically about specific policies that Bill Clinton was considering. Would you be more likely to support him if he offered this particular government service, or if he offered that one? Those people told them what they thought. Mark Penn transmitted that to Bill Clinton, and it came out of his mouth. So essentially it was suburban voters in the 90s were creating American domestic policy, and some of its foreign policy as well.
Right.
Yeah, Mark Penn was polling on questions like whether we should bomb in Bosnia, things like that.
Morris also insisted that Clinton make a symbolic sacrifice of the old politics to convince the swing voters to trust him. In August 1996, Clinton signed a bill which ended the system of guaranteed help for the poor and unemployed. Welfare would be cut back after 2 years in order to force people into work. The new system was called welfare to work and would, he said, be a hand up, not a handout. It was the effective end of the guaranteed welfare system created by President Roosevelt 60 years before. For many in Clinton's cabinet, it was also the end of the progressive political ideal that Roosevelt had represented. The belief that one used a position of leadership to persuade the voters to think and behave as social beings, not as self-interested individuals.
Dick Morris and the pollsters had won. And by that I mean that the people who ultimately got to the president, shaped the president's mind, were those who viewed the voters as just a collection of individual desires that had to be catered to and pandered to. It suggests that democracy is nothing more, and should be nothing more, than pandering to these unthought about, very primitive desires. Primitive in the sense that they are not even necessarily conscious, just what people want in terms of satisfying themselves.
Então, na verdade, a gente está com 6 grupos. Vocês já entraram? O grupo lá já entrou. Entra já, perguntar, checar a intenção de voto rapidinho e aqui. Começando.
Faz essa confusão. Quem tiver bolsa, carteira, agenda, vai colocar aqui, para não ficar equilibrando no colo.
Liga não, melhor do que isso.
E aí, para começar, então... Vai se travar a decisão final. Eu só quero saber, então, só para a gente saber. A gente vai ver o debate juntos e a gente vai comentar. A gente vai dizer o que a gente está pensando, o que a gente está achando, se a gente está gostando disso ou daquilo, se está entendendo, se não está entendendo.
Você vai dar início ao debate sorteando o primeiro eleitor e vai fazer a primeira pergunta desta noite.
Sou a Maria de Oliveira Lima. Como é que um pai de família ganhando salário mínimo vai comprar uma casa?
É o candidato José Serra. Gente que tem dinheiro para poder pegar um financiamento. Tem gente que não tem dinheiro. Nesse caso, o poder público tem que entrar no assunto. Tem que ter subsídio. E nós pretendemos fazer isso no nosso programa de habitação para o Brasil.
No Brasil foram construídas 4.400.000 casas. Do jeito que você sabe que o povo faz um quarto, cozinha e entra dentro. O que para essas pessoas que ganham pouco, salário mínimo, ou que não ganham nada, que estão aí como indigentes, nós temos que assumir o subsídio.
Mas o que tem mais receita para a Previdência, vai ter mais receita para a Previdência. Não sabe disso? É preciso ter mais para ter mais arrecadação, você tem mais receita de emprego e diminuir a informalidade, ou seja, aumentar o número de pessoas que trabalhando contribuem para a Previdência. Com isso, nós vamos arrecadar mais e poder pagar
Oi, tá ótimo, viu? Tá ótimo, fala com as pessoas, tá respondendo, tá se mantendo calmo, olha nos olhos das pessoas que perguntam e o Serra não olha, o Serra vira de costas, fica olhando pro Lula demais, entendeu?
Vamos resumir. O que a gente falaria pro Lula? Lula, presta atenção, vai direto ao assunto, não decepciona.
De quem? Seguinte, eu não tô conseguindo falar com ninguém, tá? Com meu pai, só tô conseguindo o seu telefone. É o seguinte, ele tá bem, muito bem, mas ele tá começando a notar que as pessoas assim, deixa eu te contar uma coisa, tem que ficar assim, então tem que ser mais claro no início da resposta, responder, tá? Ele tá ficando um pouco vago, os mais críticos estão percebendo, o resto não. Beijo.
Essa história de que ele tá sempre contando historinha, tá começando a pegar, mesmo pra quem é simpático pra ele.
Exatamente.
Não conta historinha, não começa a contar a morte da bezerra e vai direto ao assunto, me faz a proposta.
Não é temos que fazer, é vamos fazer. O que eles estão falando não é deveríamos fazer, é vamos fazer.
Deixa eu pegar um copo, pelo amor de Deus.
Foi pior, assim.
Deixa eu pegar um copinho.
Não foi pior, né? Foi. Ele deu uma caída, o Serra cresceu. Eles não gostam que ele caia na provocação do Serra, que ele dê repique em cima do... O Serra provoca, ele não tem que repicar. Cada vez que ele repica, ele dança.
O Serra cresceu, tá? Ele não tá mais gerando antipatia, ele tá falando como. O Lula tá precisando falar um pouco mais o como. Uma coisa que fica muito legal quando ele fala é aquela história do círculo virtuoso. Isso é uma coisa muito legal. Quando ele conta aquela história de assim, primeiro tem que aumentar a renda das pessoas, o poder de compra, porque isso vai movimentar a indústria, assim a gente vai movimentar a exportação, assim a gente vai movimentar o link de segurança, emprego e educação. Aquele link que ele faz é muito legal. Emprego para mais de 40, beijo.
E com esse modelo econômico que nós temos, não terá emprego. A indústria vai ter que voltar a produzir. A indústria produzindo, começa comprando, vai gerar mais um emprego. Esse emprego vai gerar mais um consumidor, vai gerar mais um trabalhador. Vai ser assim que a gente vai fazer a economia brasileira voltar a crescer, fortalecendo o nosso mercado interno, aumentando as nossas exportações e garantindo que o povo brasileiro viva com mais dignidade, com mais respeito e seja muito mais feliz.
Foi ótimo. Matou a pau, terminou super bem. Agora, não empolgou. No final, não empolgou, mas foi o melhor do começo ao fim. O melhor bloco foi o terceiro bloco. E a nota média foi 8.
Falou assim? Todos os 6 grupos, muito bem. Beijo. Tchau.
Fundamentally, here we have two different views of human nature and of democracy. You have the view that people are irrational, that they are bundles of unconscious emotion. That comes directly out of Freud. And businesses are very able to respond to that. That's what they have honed their skills doing. That's what marketing is really all about. What are the symbols, the music, the images, the words that will appeal to these unconscious feelings? Politics must be more than that. Politics and leadership are about engaging the public in a rational discussion and deliberation about what is best, and treating people with respect in terms of their rational abilities to debate what is best. If it's not that, if it is Freudian, if it is basically a matter of appealing to the same basic unconscious feelings that business appeals to, then why not let business do it? Business can do it better. Business knows how to do it. Business, after all, is in the business of responding to those